I'm going to really start off with some slides to put into context the impact that we're seeing of healthcare reform, not only here in the US, but on a global basis, on the delivery of technologies. I'll focus predominantly on medical devices, although clearly for Abbott, this impact is felt across our entire business, whether that be our pharmaceutical, our diagnostics, or medical device businesses. Particularly, I'm going to talk on the front end regarding what major trends we see, whether those be demographics or overall globalization, which are affecting how we consider technologies as they're brought into the market. And then I want to spend a great deal of time on the back end of my presentation and how companies I see are managing through this fairly turbulent time in a means by which we can improve not only the predictability, but the potential successes for technologies, which I think will affect the overall delivery of healthcare over the next decade. I'd be remiss to not talk about things in the context of, although medical devices and prescription drugs are part of the equation, it is far from the entire part of the equation. And here, just shown in the United States, you can see that prescription drugs in 2007 represented approximately 10% of our overall spending in healthcare. Medical devices being, particularly in hospital, a portion of hospital care, and also some portion of those devices which are used out of hospital. And I know through the presentations over the course of the day today, you'll hear from various different segments and various different segments, because in order to truly address the efficiency and effectiveness of healthcare systems, one needs to consider all aspects of the pieces of this fairly large and obviously growing expenditures for the country. Also put into context what we see, and it's not only the aging of our population around the world, but the relative magnitude of patients who are entering what one could consider the consumption of healthcare dollars, which is very heavily focused on patients towards the end of their life, particularly those in 65 to 100. And although it's a portion of the pie in Asia, it is absolutely a large number of patients which are entering this portion of their life in which healthcare dollars are predominantly consumed. So globalization issues, and particularly the emergence of Asia as an important part of our global healthcare system, is absolutely critical to understand. One of the drivers, and you'll hear about this, and I'm sure you're aware of it, is what many people may call the epidemic, if you will, of diabetes, and how diabetes, not only prevalence, but incidence and the percentage of patients who have diabetes are detected around the world. And shown on this chart is just in high categorization how many patients are diagnosed in India, with really here 20 million people in comparison to the 20 million patients we have here in the US, but a much larger prevalence, indicating that perhaps one of our solutions long-term to addressing the impact that diabetes has on healthcare systems is earlier identification and earlier treatment of a disease, which can lead to significant comorbidities and issues for patients over the course of time. Another driver for what's going on in the healthcare system, particularly in medical devices, but across, is the integration of really four major categories of technologies. The integration of IT into devices, pharmaceuticals in devices, IT into pharmaceuticals, and the growing focus on whether we can, through genetics, understand the predisposition for a patient to respond to therapy, whether that be a pharmacologic therapy or device-based therapy. And with these four major integrations, one area of technology that I'm very familiar with, and we see this already impacting how therapies are being developed over time, is the field of interventional cardiology. And one can see that although in the first 25 years of interventional cardiology, the predominant mode of therapy was mechanical, whether that be with balloon angioplasty or atherectomy devices, the primary therapy being offered to the patient was mechanical therapy. Now we're making the transition. We used radiation for a period of time, now drug-eluting stents, moving forward into the use of proteins and or other genetic engineering approaches to actually move into molecular cardiology. And this is having an impact on the marketplace. It's having an impact on a number of therapies, since when one looks at the overall evolution of an industry, these are technology integrations which are happening in the more recent decades. And shown here in interventional cardiology, it's been 70 years of therapy development, predominantly now approaching 4 decades of interventional approaches in the coronaries, but drug-eluting stents represents the last 10 years. And you can see on this slide the fairly rapid adoption of technology. You can see the turnover and growth of percutaneous coronary interventions, which occurred first with the evolution of bare metal stents, and then the opportunity to add a pharmacologic agent to a bare metal stent to reduce the incidence of restenosis and improve the outcome for these patients over the course of time. And that has really driven a PCI volume here in the United States of approximately 1.1 million procedures and a fairly rapid adoption of technology. But with that has come challenges. Those challenges predominantly as we integrate technologies, whether they be drugs into devices or IT or information systems into pharmacologic therapy, we're putting stress on our regulatory approval system here in the United States, what these so-called combination products represent. And although there have been combination products over the course of time, which started out with a pharmacologic agent and a device which were packaged separately but intended to be used together, to those which are now being integrated, fully integrated together, for which the safety and effectiveness of the product is predominantly driven by the integration of those two therapies into one device or one overall approach for treating the patient. What's the implications of that? Well, clearly as we integrate therapies, they become more complex. Understanding the second-order effects of that integration are increasingly challenging, requiring longer clinical trials and more investment for companies to bring these into a market reality. So what does that mean? And I'm just going to use by example several technologies that are part of our business in the medical device field of Abbott and how these integrative challenges are affecting the overall utilization. And then I'm going to summarize at the end with how companies are trying to deal with this increasing challenge. If you look here, and I mentioned percutaneous coronary interventions here in the United States, and you can focus on the upper part of this slide where we see roughly 1 billion procedures being done in our 300 million patients, which gives us a PCI per million rate of approximately 3,400. You can look at that utilization rate in the main categorization of Europe, where it's 1,100, in India, where it's 106. So we have here an order of magnitude difference between the adoption rate of PCIs per million in India versus what we have in Europe and or clearly less than the United States. You can see China at just approaching 200 and Japan fairly high utilization of this therapy at 1,700. Now Europe, although we many times talk about it as an aggregation, one can see that even within Europe, where for percutaneous coronary intervention products are approved via the CE mark, that there's factors which are influencing the adoption of a technology which can change that utilization. And you can see since the average is 1.1 or 1,100, that there's a number of countries below this chart which actually have utilization far below that average in order to have these utilizations in Switzerland or Germany, which are actually in excess of the utilization we have here in the United States. So it's not just technology that drives therapy adoption. There's other factors, clearly reimbursement and the overall approach physicians have to treating patients at different deciles of their life. What are those factors? And I just summarize them here, and how does that impact not only the opportunity to treat a patient with PCI, but also the adoption of technology. I showed before the fairly rapid adoption of drug-eluting stents here in the United States as a means of improving outcome. Well, that adoption rate across Europe is about 50%. Here in the United States, currently it's about 80%. And as shown on this slide, you can see there are many factors which influence the adoption. These are generally the same patients with the same disease etiology and the same demographics which are driving them into the opportunity to be treated with not only PCI but drug-eluting stents, but clearly there are factors in our healthcare system which are affecting overall utilization. Well, what does that mean? If one looks at it on this chart, you can see the size of the circles are representing the numbers of PCIs which are being done. How is the year-over-year PCI growth, percutaneous coronary intervention growth rate, 1 year versus the next? And what is the overall utilization of drug-eluting stents, so the drug-eluting stent penetration? You can see that the two countries, large countries obviously, that are growing rapidly are India and China. Their utilization of DES is actually quite high, but their growth rates now are far outstripping the growth rates of PCI in any individual country or here in the United States or Europe as a whole. So what does this mean? Well, if one looks at these growth rates, which are now almost between 15 to 20%, that means every 5 years you're doubling the number of procedures which are done. And in approximately 5 years, the number of percutaneous coronary interventions done in India and China will exceed that number that's done here in the United States, right? Requiring investment in the infrastructure to support the therapy, requiring the training of physicians, requiring the overall understanding and utilization of the technology. But you can see there's very different growth rates. What does this drive in terms of our looking at market structures? We used to talk about interventional cardiology or cardiology in general as being a 70-30 market, where 70% of the market opportunity was here in the US, 30% OUS. Well, it's almost flipped 60-40, and soon with these growth rates of the international patients, aging of those patients, acceptance of technology, we're headed over the next decade towards the opportunity for therapies to be brought into the global market, being 20% here, 80% outside of the United States. It's important to understand that as you look at global companies and how they're pursuing the globalization of technologies. I'll just make 2 other points and then talk about the strategies companies are using in other therapeutic areas. Here's a chart which shows cataract procedures, probably one of the oldest surgical procedures, the most common surgical procedure done here in the United States. And you can see, given the longevity that this procedure has had across the globe, there's much more of a uniformity of how procedures are being performed, with the exclusion here, I would say, of China, which is relatively underutilizing this therapy versus the rest of the procedures per million or calculations you'd see in most other countries. And I show this slide for laser vision correction. How many of you have had laser vision correction? You know, by show of hands, you can see it here in the United States. If you do this calculation, it's 0.002 per million. So clearly a therapy, which for those who have had it, it's remarkable in terms of the clarity of vision that can be provided, but a therapy which is challenged to get its overall penetration to a level where we see other medical procedures. So how is this affecting innovation? And I want to focus on really 3 aspects towards this. The increased risk is driving decreased investment. That is a reality. I know there's several speakers which will talk about this in the context of investing, whether it's entrepreneurial investors, venture capital investing, or even syndicated investments. The increased risk is driving a decreased investment. How are companies responding, companies like Abbott and other companies, to increase our return on investment? Because we are in this business, we're not getting out of it. How do we improve our return? And then finally, really an emerging area, instead of innovations being pushed into the market or pulled into the market, I wanted to just compare and contrast how those 2 technology development really are being invested in by various companies. So first, with the integration of more complex technologies, we're seeing overall more risk, more time to develop these technologies, and by virtue of that, more money being required to bring them through to commercial reality. What that's driving is less predictability, lower returns, and less investment. And this is the challenge, I think, overall we see within the healthcare environment. Well, what are some of the implications of that? We are seeing small company exits. They can no longer raise the capital in order to bring their technologies to fruition. That's a challenge because, at least in the medical device field, a great deal of the innovation, whether it's been in cardiology, orthopedics, or even in the area of ophthalmology, a lot of that innovation has come into the marketplace via small companies and entrepreneurial ventures. We're seeing fewer medical device companies pursuing PMA products. Although 510Ks are not easy, they are generally shorter and more predictable than PMA products. We're seeing increasing timelines and requirements for 510Ks as well, and overall, more OUS-only technologies. Right? When 80% of the market, global market, exists outside the United States, and the challenges of coming through our regulatory approval process here is made more complex, companies are choosing to not enter the US, which does create some challenges for our overall healthcare system. You can hear these statistics. It clearly is a reduction in number of companies submitting PMAs. The timelines for PMAs are getting longer. The timelines for 510Ks are getting longer. There's a decreased level of investment from the venture community. All of this is putting a challenge on the overall innovations that are brought into the healthcare environment. Another factor is the consolidation. So we've seen consolidation in interventional cardiology. 3 decades ago, there were many companies in interventional cardiology. Now there are predominantly 4. In the cardiac rhythm management field, there are predominantly 3. Right? In ophthalmology, there are 3. And so what's becoming more and more challenging is companies striving to be bigger and broader and more global in order to address the overall challenges of the healthcare system. So how are companies responding? And I break this up in the slide into really 4 different buckets. We see internal and external incubators, early stage equity investments, and entrepreneurial structures. How are companies dealing to put innovation into a cycle that can be successful on the front end? Reusing building blocks, trying to fail those technologies early and then increasing preclinical evaluations in order to improve the predictability of technologies when they hit the fairly expensive clinical regulatory phase, which is now driven by larger first-in-man trials, trials which are set to get global approvals, and an increasing commitment to conduct post-approval trials as a condition of approval in various countries around the world. And then finally, once you have a technology to improve your return on investment, how do you take that technology global as quickly as possible, not only to increase revenues, but to manage the overall risk of reimbursement and overall life cycle management, where we're able to then iterate internationally while bringing technologies in a more gated fashion here to the United States. One of these areas, and I mentioned this before, in the past it was small companies pushing technology into the market. Now we see much more companies moving in a structure where they actually pull technologies forward. They actually have a clinical need and they set a structure in place to try to pull the idea from idea generation to invention to innovation. Now, sometimes they're called incubators, but really it's an opportunity to identify a large clinical need and then bring it forward. One that I'm very familiar with within our legacy Guidant organization, now Abbott organization, is the development of a fully bioabsorbable drug-eluting stent, an idea which has been really resident for many years. We created an entity, an entrepreneurial entity, to take this technology from early concept development into commercial reality, and in a relatively short period of time. And I say relatively because the idea has been about as old as one can be in interventional cardiology, where a significant amount of progress has been made over the last 7 years. So in summary, what are those factors? What are the main factors that I see affecting the development of technology? We're seeing more complex technologies with more expensive and longer development times. This is driving fewer companies to be participating in the development of these technologies. We're seeing fewer but bigger clinical trials, and that has an impact overall on healthcare systems and academic as well as clinical institutions around the world. We're seeing earlier clinical direction and focused endpoints being a key to success. So starting to focus earlier to improve the success of a technology later is becoming more of the norm as opposed to where it had been range finding to say in the past. And then finally, I think we're seeing fewer but bigger product advancements. So one can call that stage gating of technology advancements, but because it takes so much to get it through the pipe, focusing on bigger technologies, but with more spacing between them. I think technology convergence is here to stay. It's a reality. I think it has tremendous potential to improve the outcome for patients. And as I mentioned, that's IT services into devices, devices into pharmaceuticals, or vice versa, and overall genetic engineering into understanding the predisposition of patients to respond to either pharmacologic or device-based therapy. Public policy reimbursement structures now are becoming increasingly important in the adoption and utilization of technology, even though those technologies may be more broadly and more globally available. And then finally, I think as in any case, with these challenges comes the opportunity for those companies who can figure out how to navigate through those challenges to have an increasing impact, not only for their own corporate growth over the course of time, but their overall development of certain therapeutic categories.